Have you ever wondered what happens when civilization falls away completely? When you're surrounded by nothing but wilderness, miles from help, and something goes terribly, impossibly wrong. The stories you're about to hear aren't fiction. They're not urban legends passed down through campfire tales. These are documented events where people face the incomprehensible in the most isolated places on Earth, places where screaming brings no rescue, where running leads nowhere, and where the only witnesses are the trees, the rocks, and whatever else might be watching from the darkness. Tonight, we're diving into 5 terrifying true stories from the middle of nowhere. And I promise you, after hearing these, you'll never look at remote places the same way again. Let me ask you something right now, before we begin. Have you ever been truly alone? Not alone in your room with your phone nearby, but genuinely isolated, where the nearest human being is miles away and there's no cell service, no GPS, no way to call for help. Take a moment and think about that. Now imagine that in that isolation, something happens that defies all rational explanation. That's where our first story begins. Story 1. The abandoned tent in the Oregon wilderness. August of 2013, southern Oregon. The mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, covered in dense forests that hadn't changed in centuries. To military police officers, both trained for danger, both experienced outdoorsmen, decided to explore the forgotten logging roads that crisscrossed the wilderness. These weren't tourist trails. These were paths that time had reclaimed, overgrown, and barely passable, leading deep into territories where few people ventured anymore. They wanted adventure. They found something else entirely. The day started hot, oppressively so. The kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and distorts your vision. Thunderstorms were building over the mountains, dark clouds gathering like an omen. But they pressed on, their truck bouncing over ruts and rocks, pushing deeper into the backcountry. The logging road they followed was ancient, barely visible beneath the encroaching vegetation. Trees pressing on both sides, creating a tunnel of green that grew darker the further they went. The temperature inside the truck climbed despite the approaching storm, and the silence outside was absolute. No birds, no insects, nothing. Here's something you should know about the wilderness in southern Oregon. This region has seen its share of darkness. Serial killers have dumped bodies in these forests. People have gone missing and never been found. The vastness swallows secrets, and the mountains keep them. When you're driving through terrain like this, that knowledge sits in the back of your mind like a weight. Every abandoned structure, every lonely clearing, carries the possibility of horror. They'd been driving for hours when they came to a meadow. It appeared suddenly, an opening in the trees that stretched maybe 100 yards across. And there, in the middle of this meadow, miles from any road, miles from any campground, sat a tent. A large tent, the kind designed for extended camping trips. But something about it was immediately wrong. The way it sat there, perfectly still in the gathering storm wind. The complete absence of any vehicle, any sign of how it got there. The eerie silence that hung over the entire clearing. Think about this for a moment. You're in the middle of nowhere, on a road that barely exists, and you find a tent. What do? Your instinct might be to investigate, to make sure someone isn't in trouble. But there's another instinct, isn't there? The one that tells you to turn around and leave. The one that screams that something is fundamentally wrong about this scene. These 2 men, trained for dangerous situations, felt that second instinct powerfully. But they also felt a responsibility to check. They decided to investigate, but with precaution. One would approach while the other stayed with the truck, engine running, ready for a quick escape. Already their training was overriding their curiosity, telling them to prepare for the worst. The man who approached the tent moved slowly, his senses on high alert. The tent was large, easily big enough for a family, but there was no campfire ring, no cooking equipment, no chairs or coolers. Just the tent, sitting alone in this impossible location. He called out. His voice echoed across the meadow and disappeared into the trees. No response. He called again, louder this time. Still nothing. The tent didn't move, didn't flutter in the wind that was beginning to pick up. It just sat there, heavy with implication. He moved closer, and that's when he noticed the zipper. It was partially open, revealing darkness inside. He could see shapes within, but the angle and the shadows made it impossible to identify what they were. His heart was pounding now, adrenaline flooding his system. Every instinct told him to walk away, but he'd come this far. He reached the tent entrance and pulled the flap open wider, letting afternoon light spill inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. The tent was full, not with camping equipment, but with backpacks. Dozens of backpacks, all women's styles, piled and scattered throughout the interior. And clothing, women's clothing, strewn everywhere, hanging from the tent poles, lying in heaps on the ground. No sleeping bags, no camp stoves, no normal camping gear at all. Just backpacks and clothes, like trophies collected and displayed. Now pause here and really imagine this. You're alone, miles from help, and you just discovered what looks like evidence of multiple abductions or worse. Your mind starts racing through possibilities, each more horrifying than the last. How many backpacks? How many women? Where are they now? And more immediately, more urgently, who put this tent here? And are they watching you right now? He backed away from the tent quickly, his eyes scanning the tree line. The forest suddenly seemed alive with menace, every shadow a potential threat. He turned to run back to the truck, to his partner, to tell him they needed to leave immediately. But as he broke through the edge of the trees, he saw something that stopped him cold. His partner was yelling, screaming actually, with real terror in his voice. And there was a car on the road behind them, blocking their exit. It was a beat-up old Ford Taurus, rust-eaten and filthy, and it had appeared silently while he'd been at the tent. It was positioned deliberately to prevent their escape, angled across the narrow logging road. Through the dirty windows, he could see two men in the front seats, and in the back, pressed against the window, was a third figure. Not sitting up, not moving, just lying there like a discarded doll, face against the glass. This is the moment where true terror crystallizes. When you realize you're not just afraid of what might happen, but you're in actual, immediate danger. They were boxed in the car behind them, the forest on both sides, and somewhere in that forest, the owner of the tent full of backpacks. His partner had already made the decision. The truck's engine roared to life, and he made a run for it, diving into the passenger seat as his partner gunned the accelerator. They went off-road. The truck bounced violently as they cut across the meadow, aiming for a gap in the trees that might lead back to the logging road beyond the Taurus. The driver of the car reacted immediately, trying to move to block them again. But they had momentum. They crashed through brush, the truck's suspension screaming in protest. Branches scraping and scratching at the windows like claws trying to get in. Behind them, through the rearview mirror, they could see the Taurus attempting to turn around on the narrow road, could see it struggling in the tight space. They drove like madmen. Every second they expected to hear gunfire, expected the truck to break down, expected the road ahead to be blocked by another vehicle. The logging road was a nightmare at this speed, the truck going airborne over bumps, sliding around corners. But they didn't slow down. They couldn't, not until they hit the highway. Not until they were back in civilization, back where other people existed, where help was possible. When they finally reached the main road, they didn't stop. They kept driving until they found a state police station. They made the report, told the officers everything they'd seen. The tent, the backpacks, the clothing, the Taurus, the figure in the back seat. A trooper promised to investigate. But here's the thing, and this is what haunts the storyteller. To this day, they never heard back. Not about what was found, not about whether any arrests were made, nothing. It's as if the meadow, that tent, the car full of men, simply vanished back into the wilderness. And here's what keeps him awake at night. They never got a good look at the figure in the back of that Taurus. They couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, couldn't tell if it was alive or dead. They just know someone was there, pressed against the window, while two men in the front seat stared at them with unreadable expressions. What were they planning? What would have happened if they'd been slower to react, slower to escape? And most terrifyingly, Did anyone else stumble upon that tent before or after them? Think about all those backpacks. Think about all those items of clothing. Each one represents a person. Each one has a story. Are those people still out there somewhere, lost in those endless forests? Or are they part of the mountain now? Their secrets buried under pine needles and soil. Their disappearances unexplained mysteries and distant police files. The wilderness keeps its secrets, and sometimes those secrets are darker than any nightmare you could imagine. Story 2. The Dyatlov Pass Incident 9, Deaths in the Russian Wilderness. Let's travel now to Russia in 1959, to the Ural Mountains, to a peak with a name that translates to Dead Mountain. This story has haunted investigators for over 60 years, spawning countless theories, government investigations, and scientific studies. But despite all the analysis, despite all the evidence collected, the core mystery remains as terrifying and inexplicable today as it was when 9 experienced hikers died under circumstances that defy rational explanation. Igor Dyatlov was 23 years old, an engineering student, tough, experienced, and respected by his peers. He assembled a team of 8 friends, all skilled winter hikers and campers, people who knew the wilderness, who understood the dangers of extreme cold and isolation. These weren't naive tourists. They were Soviet citizens tempered by hard living, people who'd survived other expeditions in brutal conditions. They set out in January 1959 to reach a remote mountain peak, a journey classified as Category 3 difficulty, the highest level. They expected challenges. They didn't expect to die. The last person to see them alive was one of their own. Yuri Yudin fell early in the trek and had to turn back. He said goodbye to his friends, watched them disappear into the wilderness, and never saw them again. That decision to turn back saved his life. What happened to the others has become one of history's most disturbing mysteries. Here's what we know. On February 1st, the group set up camp on the slopes of Kolit-Syakhl, Dead Mountain. The location was strange, not in a valley where they'd have shelter from the wind, but on an exposed slope. Why there? Some speculate they wanted the challenge. Others suggest they'd gotten disoriented as darkness fell. But they pitched their tent, they prepared for the night. They were settling in for rest. The temperature was 40 degrees below 0 Celsius. The wind was howling, and then something happened. Something so terrifying, so immediately threatening. The 9 experienced winter campers cut their way out of their tent from the inside. Not through the door, through the fabric itself, slashing it with knives in their panic to escape. And they ran into the sub-zero night, into the screaming wind, away from the tent that was their only shelter, their only chance of survival. Several of them were in their underwear. Some had only socks on their feet. They fled into conditions that would kill them within hours, and they did it willingly, desperately, as if staying in that tent meant certain death. Let that sink in for a moment. What could make people choose to run into a Siberian blizzard wearing almost nothing? What threat could be so immediate, so overwhelming, that hypothermia seemed like the better option? Think about the most frightening thing you can imagine, then multiply it by the factor of knowing that staying where you are means something worse than freezing to death. Rescue teams found their tent 3 weeks later, on February 26th. It was still standing, still anchored, partially buried in snow, but it had been slashed open from the inside, the fabric torn in long jagged cuts. Inside, their supplies were still their food, clothing, everything they needed to survive. But the hikers were gone, and the scene they left behind raised more questions than it answered. Why slash the tent? Why not use the door? And why, when you're running for your life, do you not grab your boots? The search team followed footprints leading away from the tent. 8 or 9 sets of footprints made by people wearing socks, single shoes, or nothing at all on their feet. The tracks led down the slope toward a forest about 1.5 miles away. But after 500 meters, the prints were covered by fresh snow, swallowed by the mountain. The rescuers pushed on toward the tree line, and there, under a massive cedar tree, they found the first 2 bodies. Yuri Krivonashenko and Yuri Doroshenko lay in the snow wearing only their underwear. Dead. Frozen. But that wasn't the strangest part. The cedar tree above them had branches broken off up to 5 meters high, as if someone had climbed it frantically, breaking limbs as they went. Why would hypothermic, dying men climb a tree in the middle of a blizzard? What were they looking at? What were they trying to see or to escape? The autopsy revealed something that still gives investigators chills. Their bodies showed signs of livor mortis on their backs, indicating they'd been lying on their backs when they died. But they were found face up, which meant someone or something had moved them after death. Over the next few days, searchers found 3 more bodies scattered between the cedar and the tent. Igor Dyatlov himself was 300 meters from the tree, face down in the snow. Zenaida Kolmogorova was found 630 meters from the cedar. Rustin Slobodin was 480 meters away. All 3 appeared to have been trying to make their way back to the tent, crawling through the snow, desperate to reach shelter. None of them made it. All 3 died of hypothermia. But here's what's strange: they were spread out, not together, as if each had been alone in their final moments, struggling independently through the darkness. The last 4 bodies weren't found until May, when the snow finally melted enough. They were in a ravine, beneath for meters of snow, and what happened to them was different, horrifically different. These 4 hadn't just died of cold. They'd been injured, catastrophically injured in ways that couldn't be explained by a fall or by exposure to the elements. Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolay Bobrynyolis, Semyon Zolotaryev, and Lyudmila Dubinina were found in what appeared to be a makeshift snow den. They tried to survive, tried to create shelter, but their bodies told a story of violence. The Bobrynyolis had massive skull damage. Dubinina and Zolotaryev had severe chest fractures, the kind of trauma you'd see in a high-speed car crash. The medical examiner said, ribs broken, internal organs damaged, injuries requiring tremendous force. But there were no external wounds, no cuts or bruises that would indicate a fight or an attack, just catastrophic internal damage. And Lyudmila Dubinina had something else wrong. Her tongue was missing, not cut out, not torn out in a way that suggested animal predation, just gone. Along with her eyes, parts of her lips, and some facial tissue. The soft tissues were absent, removed with a precision that disturbed investigators. What could do that? What would do that? The Soviet government investigated. They interviewed witnesses, examined the scene, performed autopsies. And their conclusion? A spontaneous force of nature. That was it. No specifics. No explanation of what kind of natural force could cause those injuries, could make experienced hikers flee their tent in terror, could account for the broken tree branches or the missing tongue, or the fact that some of the clothing was found to be radioactive. Yes, radioactive, low levels, but present. Why? The case was classified, sealed, forbidden territory for decades. And in that vacuum of official information, theories flourished. A military weapon test gone wrong, secret aircraft, infrasound from the mountain causing panic and paranoia. An avalanche, though the slope wasn't steep enough and no evidence of an avalanche was found. Indigenous people attacking the group, though the Mansi people denied any involvement and had no motive. Paradoxical and dressing from hypothermia, which explains some things, but not the massive internal injuries or the tent being cut from inside. More exotic theories emerged. Ball lightning, a yeti, government experimentation, aliens. Each theory attempts to explain the unexplainable, to make sense of a scenario that seems to defy natural law. But here's what we know for certain. 9 people died. They fled something. They endured unimaginable suffering, and whatever killed them left no clear evidence of what it was. In 2021, Swiss scientists published a study suggesting a rare type of delayed slab avalanche could explain some of the injuries. A small avalanche, hours after the tent was set up, could have struck the sleeping hikers with enough force to cause the chest trauma. The panic could have made them cut their way out and flee. But even these scientists admitted they couldn't explain everything. Not the missing tongue, not the radioactivity, not why the rescuers found no clear avalanche debris. They said, and I quote, We do not claim to have solved the diet law past mystery. And that's the truly terrifying thing, isn't it? In our modern world, with all our science and technology, with decades of investigation and analysis, we still don't know what killed 9 people on that mountain. We don't know what made them so afraid that death by freezing seemed preferable to staying in their tent. We don't know what force broke their ribs and crushed their skulls without leaving external bruises. We don't know why they climbed the tree or what they were looking for in the darkness. The mountain is still there. Dead Mountain. Call it Sayakal. You can visit it if you want. Tour groups go there now, retracing the doomed expedition's route. But I have to wonder, would you camp there? Would you pitch a tent on that slope, knowing that 6 decades ago, 9 people died there in ways we still can't explain? Would you sleep soundly? Or would you lie awake listening to the wind, wondering if every strange sound is just weather or something else, something we don't understand, something that might still be there in the darkness? Story 3. The Vanishing Lighthouse Keepers of Flannan Isle. Let's leave the mountains now and travel to the sea, to Scotland's Outer Hebrides, to a cluster of rocky islands known as the Flannan Isles. It's December of 1900, and we're about to explore a mystery that has haunted maritime history. For over a century, the impossible disappearance of 3 lighthouse keepers from a location they should never have been able to leave. The Flannan Isles are desolate. Imagine rocks jutting from the Atlantic Ocean, battered by waves, scoured by wind, home to seabirds and little else. No trees, no shelter, just stone and grass and the endless roar of water. Isle Moor, the largest island, spans barely 1/3 of a mile. Cliffs rise sheer from the sea, making landing difficult and dangerous. There's an old chapel ruin on the island from the 7th century, built by a saint or hermit seeking ultimate isolation. For centuries, local shepherds would bring sheep to graze there but would never, ever spend the night. The island had a reputation. The locals called it cursed, haunted by something ancient and malevolent. In 1899, they built a lighthouse there, 23 meters tall, designed to warn ships away from the deadly rocks. Operating it required 3 keepers who would rotate in 6-week shifts, living in near total isolation, dependent on supply ships that came when weather permitted. The work was brutal, lonely, and dangerous. But the keepers were professionals, men who understood the sea and respected its power. On December 7th, 1900, 3 men were on duty. James DeCat, the principal keeper, 43 years old, experienced and reliable. Thomas Marshall, assistant keeper, in his late 30s, a career lighthouse man who'd spent 20 years on remote stations. Donald MacArthur, occasional keeper, filling in for someone on sick leave, known on the mainland as a tough, no-nonsense mariner who'd been in his share of brawls. These were not weak men, not timid men, not men who scared easily. On December 15th, a passing ship noticed something wrong. The lighthouse was dark, no light warned ships away from the rocks. No signal confirmed anyone was there. The ship reported it when they reached port, but a storm delayed any investigation. It wasn't until Boxing Day, December 26th, that the relief vessel Hesperus reached the island. Captain James Harvey commanded the Hesperus. As they approached, he blew the ship's horn. No response. He raised a flag, sent up a flare. The island remained silent. A sense of unease spread through the crew. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Joseph Moore, the relief keeper, volunteered to investigate. He rode to the island, climbed the 160 steep steps to the lighthouse, and found the entrance gate closed. The main door was shut. He opened it and stepped inside, and what he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. The lighthouse was empty. Completely, utterly empty of human life. The clock on the kitchen wall had stopped. The beds were unmade. A meal sat on the table, uneaten. A chair was overturned. Everything suggested the keepers had left in a hurry. But where had they gone? Moore searched frantically the tower, the storage rooms, everywhere. Nothing. No sign of the 3 men. No note, no explanation, no bodies. Just absence, heavy and oppressive, filling the rooms like a presence. he found one more thing that made no sense. In the hallway, the keeper's oilskins hung on hooks, waterproof coats essential for working outside in the brutal Atlantic weather. 2 coats were missing. One was still there, which meant one man had gone outside without protection from the elements. Why? In December, on an island where wind and spray are constant, why would anyone go out without their coat? Captain Harvey sent more men to search. They combed the island, looking for any trace of the keepers. They found signs of a recent storm at the West Landing. A supply box that should have been secured had been torn from its position 33 meters above sea level, its contents scattered. Iron railings were bent and twisted. A heavy iron railway track had been ripped from its concrete moorings. The damage was significant, but here's the thing: this was normal for the location. Storms hit the island regularly, waves reaching incredible heights. The keepers would have known to stay inside during rough weather. The investigators tried to piece together what happened. The lighthouse log showed the last official entry was December 13th. On a slate board, wind measurements for 9 a.m. on December 15th were written, ready to be transferred into the log, which suggests at least one keeper was alive and working that morning. But after that, nothing. No further entries. No indication of what happened next. Years later, stories emerged about additional log entries found by investigators. Supposedly, Marshall had written about a terrible storm on December 12th, the worst he'd ever seen in 20 years. He wrote that Decat was strangely quiet, that MacArthur was crying, which made no sense given MacArthur's reputation as a hardened seaman. A final entry supposedly from December 15th read, "Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all." But here's the thing: these entries were later proven to be fabrications. Sensationalized additions to make the story more mysterious. They never existed. The real log ended on the 13th, and whatever happened after that was never recorded. So what are the facts? 3 experienced lighthouse keepers vanished from an island they could not easily leave. No boat was missing. They couldn't swim. The water was too cold, too rough, the cliffs too sheer. Yet they were gone, all 3 of them, leaving behind food, belongings, and 1 coat. No bodies were ever found, not washed up on the island, not floating in the sea, not anywhere along the Scottish coast despite weeks of searching. The official conclusion was that 2 keepers went to the West Landing to secure equipment during the storm, and a rogue wave swept them away. The 3rd keeper, seeing this from the lighthouse, grabbed his coat and ran to help, only to be caught by another wave himself. It's plausible. Rogue waves are real massive walls of water that appear without warning, capable of incredible destruction. In 1985, a rogue wave hit the Fastnet Lighthouse, 50 miles away, and was estimated at 157 feet high. Such a wave could absolutely sweep men from the rocks. But the problems with this theory are significant. If the men were swept away at the West Landing, why was the lighthouse in perfect order? Why was the lamp filled and ready? The clock wound, the beds made. These were routine tasks done at the end of a shift. If there was an emergency, would they have taken time to prepare everything as if for a normal day? And why would all 3 men go to the landing when regulations strictly forbade leaving the lighthouse unmanned? 1 man should always remain, always keep the light burning. That was the most fundamental rule of lighthouse keeping. And there's something else. The storm damage at the West Landing was clearly old, already there when the relief crew arrived. But according to witnesses on the Isle of Lewis, 16 miles away, there were no major storms between December 7th and December 26th. The weather had been rough, but not extraordinary. The lighthouse should have been visible from Lewis for most of the time, but it wasn't seen, which means it went dark sometime between December 7th and 15th, during relatively calm weather. So if not a rogue wave, then what? Some theories suggest a fight among the keepers. MacArthur was known for his temper. Maybe he snapped, killed the other 2, then threw himself off the cliffs in remorse. But there was no evidence of violence in the lighthouse, no blood, no signs of struggle. Everything was orderly, almost disturbingly so. Other theories are wilder. The folklore of the island is ancient and dark. Local legends speak of phantoms, of ghost ships that appear in the fog, of spirits that resent human intrusion. The island was named after Saint Flannan, but before the saint came, the island belonged to older beliefs, darker traditions. Could the keepers have encountered something paranormal, something that drove them to flee or that took them by force? It sounds absurd in our rational modern age, but what rational explanation fits all the facts? Here's what disturbs me most about this case. It's the calmness of the scene. A chair overturned, yes, suggesting someone left in a hurry. But the rest of the lighthouse was neat, orderly, prepared for the next day. Whatever made them leave did so suddenly, but not violently, at least not inside the building. They left as if they intended to return shortly, as if they expected to come back and finish the meal, wind the clock, climb into those unmade beds. But they never did, and we don't know why. Subsequent lighthouse keepers of Flannan reported strange experiences. Voices in the wind, calling the names of the 3 dead men. Shadows moving where no one should be. An oppressive feeling of being watched. Are these just the products of isolation and suggestion? The mind creating fears in a lonely place? Or is there something about Eileen more? Something that existed long before the lighthouse was built? Something that claimed 3 men in December of 1900 and has never been satisfied? You can visit the island if you're determined enough. The lighthouse still stands, automated now. No keepers required. But would you stay there overnight? Would you sleep in the keeper's quarters, knowing that over a century ago, 3 men vanished from those rooms under circumstances that have never been explained? Would you listen to the wind and the waves and convince yourself that's all you're hearing? Or would you wonder if something else is out there in the darkness, something patient and timeless, something that waits? Story 4. The ghost ship off Australia's coast. We're staying at sea for our 4th story, but we're moving from Scotland to the other side of the world, to the waters off Australia's coast. This story comes from a naval deployment for military personnel trained to handle crisis situations, and it represents one of the most unsettling maritime mysteries. Of modern times, the discovery of a vessel that by all logic should not exist, should not be floating, and should not be completely devoid of crew. The narrator was an engineer on a military vessel, trained for VBSS visit, board, search, and seizure operations. His job involved inspecting ships, understanding their mechanical systems, assessing potential threats. He'd boarded dozens of vessels in his career, fishing boats, cargo ships, pleasure craft, but nothing prepared him for what he found drifting off the coast of Australia on a routine patrol. They spotted it on radar first. A vessel dead in the water, not responding to radio calls. This happens sometimes: equipment failure, power loss. A dozen mechanical reasons why a ship might be adrift, but protocol required investigation. They approached cautiously, and as they got closer, the unease began to build. The ship was intact, riding normally in the water, not listing or showing signs of distress. But it was completely still. No lights, no movement on deck, no sign of anyone aboard. They hailed it repeatedly. No response. They maneuvered alongside, preparing to board. The team assembled armed, cautious, ready for anything from pirates to smugglers to a ship full of bodies. They didn't expect what they actually found, which was somehow worse than any of those scenarios. They found nothing, absolutely nothing wrong, except that the crew was gone. The boarding team swept the vessel methodically. It was a fishing boat, not huge but substantial, the kind that would carry a crew of 5 to 7 men on multi-day trips. The hold was full of fresh fish, still good, not yet rotting. On deck, equipment was laid out as if work had been interrupted mid-task. Ropes were coiled, nets were ready, everything was in its place. Down below, the galley area held more impossibilities. Food was laid out on the counter, partially prepared, and the most disturbing detail, some of it was still warm. Think about that. They found food that was still warm, which meant whatever happened to the crew had happened recently, within the last hour or two. But how recently? And more importantly, how? The ship was miles from shore, no other vessels on radar, No lifeboats missing. Where had the crew gone? They couldn't have fallen overboard all at once, not without signs of struggle or emergency. They couldn't have been picked up by another vessel without the vessel appearing on radar. They were just gone, vanished, as if they'd stepped out of reality itself. The engineering assessment was even more baffling. The ship was mechanically sound, engine in good condition, fuel tanks full, no leaks, no damage, no reason it should be adrift. The last entry in the ship's log was routine, noting position and weather, nothing unusual. The radio was functional, capable of calling for help, but showing no indication that any distress signal had been sent. Every clock aboard was working except one in the galley, which had stopped at an odd time that corresponded to nothing in the log or the ship as systems. The team searched every compartment, every storage locker, every possible hiding place. They looked for bodies, for blood, for any sign of violence or accident. Nothing. The crew's personal belongings were still in their quarters, wallets, photographs, clothing. Everything you'd expect to find was there, except the people themselves. It was as if the entire crew had simultaneously decided to leave, taking nothing, leaving everything, and somehow doing so in the middle of the ocean with no means of departure. They towed the ship to port. Authorities took over the investigation, and then something strange happened. The story disappeared. No media reports, no public announcement about missing fishermen, no updates on what the investigation revealed. The narrator and his team were told not to discuss what they'd found. When they tried to talk about it with other crew members back at base, people didn't believe them. The story was too strange, too much like a ghost story to be taken seriously. But he knows what he saw. He walked through the galley with the warm food. He saw the fish in the hold, still fresh. He felt the absolute wrongness of that empty vessel drifting silently through the ocean. And he has questions that have haunted him for years. Where did the crew go? Did they see something that made them abandon ship? Something so terrifying they left without taking anything? Without sending a distress call? Was there some kind of accident? Something that removed them from the ship without leaving any evidence? Or is there something stranger at play? Something we don't understand about the ocean and the things that happen on it? Maritime history is full of ghost ships. The Mary Celeste is the most famous, found abandoned in 1872 with food on the table, cargo intact, no sign of the crew. But that was over a century ago, in an era when ships could disappear for weeks before anyone knew they were missing. This Australian incident happened in the modern era, with satellites and radar and constant communication. A ship shouldn't be able to become a ghost ship anymore, yet this one did. Here's what keeps me awake about this story. It's not just the mystery of where the crew went, it's the cover-up, or at least the silence. Why wasn't this reported? Why isn't there a record of an investigation into multiple missing fishermen? Are the families still wondering what happened to their loved ones? Or were they given some explanation that satisfied them? And if so, what explanation could possibly make sense of a warm meal on an abandoned ship? The ocean covers 71% of Earth's surface. Most of it is unexplored, unmapped, unknown. We know more about the surface of Mars than we do about the deep ocean. Ships travel across it every day, but they're just scratching the surface, literally. Below them are depths we can barely imagine, pressures that would crush us instantly. Darkness absolute and eternal. What lives down there? What happens down there? And occasionally, does something from down there reach up and take something from the surface? I'm not saying this ship was attacked by sea monsters or abducted by underwater aliens. I'm saying we don't know what happened, and that unknown is terrifying. Because if experienced fishermen can vanish from their vessel without a trace, without time to call for help, without any sign of what took them, then anyone on the ocean is vulnerable to the same fate. You could be on a boat tomorrow, and something could happen. Something instantaneous and inexplicable, and you'd simply be gone. And the people who found your vessel would see exactly what the boarding team saw: a normal scene interrupted, a moment frozen, and an absence where people should be. The narrator still serves in the military. He still boards vessels. And every time he approaches an empty ship, every time he climbs aboard something that's just a little too quiet, he remembers the fishing boat off Australia. He remembers the warm food. He remembers the absence. And he wonders if whatever took the crew is still out there, waiting in the deep water, patient and hungry. Story 5. The missing 411 phenomenon. For our final story, we're returning to land, but we're expanding our scope. This isn't about a single incident. This is about a pattern. A series of disappearances across North America's wilderness areas that share such specific and unusual characteristics that they've been classified under a single decennia. Missing 411. David Paulides, a former law enforcement officer, began investigating these cases after park rangers approached him with concerns. They told him that people were disappearing from national parks under circumstances that didn't match normal missing person profiles. The more Paulides investigated, the more disturbing the pattern became. He's now documented over 1,400 cases, and the similarities between them are too specific to be coincidental. Here's what makes a case part of missing 411. The people vanish from national parks or wilderness areas. They're often found in locations that have already been thoroughly searched, sometimes multiple times by professional search and rescue teams. Tracking dogs can't find their scent or lose it in ways that don't make sense. The victims are found in areas much farther from their last known location than they should be able to reach. Sometimes elderly or young children covering distances and terrain that trained hikers would find challenging. Clothing is often missing or found neatly folded far from the body. The disappearances cluster in specific geographic areas. And perhaps most disturbing, there's often a complete lack of evidence, no tracks. No signs of struggle, nothing to indicate where the person went or how they got there. Let me give you a specific example. Dennis Martin, 6 years old, vanished from the Great Smoky Mountains National Park on June 14, 1969. He was with his family and another family they were friends with, camping at a site they knew well. The boy decided to play a prank. He wanted to hide and jump out to surprise the other family when they returned from a hike, so he ran a little way down the trail and went into the woods. The adults heard him giggling as he ran. That was the last time anyone heard from Dennis Martin. His disappearance sparked one of the largest search operations in national park history. Hundreds of people combed the area, park rangers, volunteers, military personnel. Tracking dogs were brought in. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew overhead. They searched for days, then weeks. Nothing, no trace of the boy. No clothing, no footprints, nothing. A 6-year-old child doesn't just vanish. Doesn't cover ground that would challenge an adult. Doesn't evade trained searchers with dogs and equipment. But Dennis Martin did. Years later, a man came forward claiming he'd seen something in the woods that day. He'd been hiking in the area when he saw what he described as a person covered in hair, running through the forest carrying something. It happened so fast he couldn't process it, and by the time he realized what he'd seen, it was gone. He didn't report it at the time because it sounded crazy, but after learning about Dennis Martin's disappearance, he wondered. The description haunts the case file: a figure moving impossibly fast through terrain that would slow anyone down, carrying something that might have been a child. Or consider the case of Dior Kunz Jr., 2 years old, who vanished from a campsite in Idaho in July 2015. His parents, his great-grandfather, and a friend of his great-grandfather were all at the site. The parents went to a nearby store for supplies, leaving Dior with his great-grandfather and the friend. When they returned less than an hour later, the boy was gone. Searches found nothing. No tracks. No evidence of animal activity. A 2-year-old simply disappeared from a campsite with adults present in broad daylight and a location surrounded by wilderness where a child that young couldn't have wandered far. But here's what makes the missing 411 cases different from normal missing person situations. It's the specific weird details that repeat across hundreds of cases. The lack of scent that dogs can follow, even when conditions should be ideal for tracking. The discovery of bodies or remains in areas that have been searched multiple times by professionals, not hidden, not buried, just there as if they appeared after the search. The strange distances involved, people found miles from where they disappeared, and terrain they couldn't have crossed. And the clusters, the geographic areas where disappearances happened repeatedly, far more than random chance would suggest. Yosemite National Park is one of these cluster zones. So is Crater Lake in Oregon, the Great Smoky Mountains, Glacier National Park. Over and over, in these specific areas, people vanish. Young children who are found miles away with no memory of how they got there. Experienced hikers who disappear on trails they know well. Hunters who simply never return. Their equipment found, but their bodies missing. And in many cases, when remains are eventually found, the bodies show no sign of animal predation, no indication of what killed them, and are located in places that make no logical sense. Paulides compiled all this data, looking for patterns, and what he found should terrify anyone who enjoys the outdoors. The disappearances aren't random. They follow specific parameters. People vanish near water sources. They vanish near boulder fields. Weather often turns bad immediately after someone goes missing, hampering search efforts. Berries are often involved, people disappearing after going to pick berries, or being found near berry bushes. And perhaps most disturbing, there's a correlation with people of German descent and people with disabilities, particularly autism spectrum disorders, disappearing at rates much higher than the general population. The National Park Service doesn't keep a centralized database of missing persons in parks. When Paulides submitted Freedom of Information requests trying to get comprehensive data, he was told it would cost millions of dollars to compile. Why? Why isn't there a simple database of people who've gone missing in national parks? Why is this information so difficult to obtain? Is it incompetence? Or is there something being concealed? Skeptics argue that missing 411 is just pattern recognition gone wrong. That when you look at enough missing person cases, you'll find coincidences that seem meaningful but aren't. They say people get lost in the wilderness all the time, that some are never found, and that the unusual details are either misreported or have natural explanations. Clothing removed due to hypothermia-induced confusion, long distances covered while disoriented, scent trails lost because of water or weather. All explainable, all natural. But that doesn't account for children found alive miles from where they disappeared, with no memory of the journey. It doesn't explain bodies found in locations searched multiple times by professionals using systematic grids. It doesn't address the clustering in specific geographic areas or the strange commonalities among the victims. And it certainly doesn't explain the cases where people simply vanish in front of witnesses. Like the woman who was hiking with her husband stepped behind a tree to relieve herself and was never seen again despite an immediate search of an area with limited exits. Here's what keeps me awake about missing 411. It's not any single case, as tragic as each one is. It's the implication of the pattern. If there is something taking people from wilderness areas, something that operates systematically enough to create these commonalities across hundreds of cases. What is it? Is it human traffickers or serial killers operating in remote areas? The lack of bodies and evidence argues against that. Is it animal bears, mountain lions, or something we haven't documented? But predators leave evidence, and tracking dogs would find that evidence. Is it something else? Something we don't have a category for? Something that exists in the wild places and occasionally takes what it wants? David Paulides doesn't speculate publicly about what's causing these disappearances. He just presents the data and lets people draw their own conclusions. But privately, in his books and documentaries, he hints at something. He mentions that many cases involve people seeing lights in the sky or experiencing strange atmospheric phenomena. He notes the areas of high strangeness, places where multiple unexplained events occur. He draws connections to other mysteries, UFO sightings, cryptid encounters, places where reality seems to work differently. I'm not telling you to believe in aliens or Bigfoot or interdimensional portals. I am telling you, that people are disappearing from wilderness areas under circumstances that don't fit standard explanations, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, because we don't have comprehensive data. They're disappearing in ways that create specific patterns that shouldn't exist if these were just random accidents, or normal predation, or people choosing to disappear. And here's the practical horror of it. You could be next. If you hike, if you camp, if you hunt or fish or spend time in national parks, you're in the same environments where these disappearances happen. You trust that if something goes wrong, search and rescue will find you. You trust that trained dogs can track you, that helicopters with thermal imaging can spot you, that leaving a trail or staying in one place will help rescuers locate you. But what if none of that matters? What if whatever takes people from these places doesn't care about our tracking methods, doesn't leave evidence we can follow, operates by rules we don't understand? The wilderness is beautiful. It's peaceful. It is one of the few places left where you can escape the noise and stress of modern life. But it's also alien to us as humans. We didn't evolve in these environments. We're visitors, tourists, and ecosystems millions of years old that operated without us and will continue after we're gone. We think we understand the wilderness because we've mapped it and named it and created trails through it. But understanding geography isn't the same as understanding what exists in those places. Every year, millions of people visit national parks. The vast majority have wonderful, safe experiences. But some don't come home. Some vanish, leaving families with questions that will never be answered and investigators with cases that will never be solved. And somewhere in the data, in the pattern of those disappearances, is a truth we may not be ready to accept. Conclusion: 5 stories, 5 locations, 5 instances where the normal rules seem to stop applying and something impossible, something terrifying, took over. From a tent full of backpacks in the Oregon wilderness to 9 dead hikers on a Russian mountain. From 3 lighthouse keepers who vanished from an island they could leave to a fishing crew that disappeared from their ship without a trace. And finally, to the pattern of disappearances across North America that suggests something systematic is happening in our wilderness areas. What connects these stories? It's not a single explanation or a unified theory. It's something more fundamental. It's the reminder that despite all our technology and knowledge, despite our ability to map the world and predict the weather and communicate instantly across thousands of miles, there are still places where we're vulnerable. Places where the certainty of civilization gives way to something older, something that doesn't care about our understanding or our safety. The terror in these stories isn't supernatural, at least not necessarily. It's the terror of the unknown, of situations that defy explanation, of people who went into remote places and encountered something that shouldn't exist according to our models of reality. Whether that something is human evil, natural forces we don't fully understand, or something stranger still, the result is the same people vanished, died, or survived with stories that change how we see the world. I started by asking if you've ever been truly alone, truly isolated. Now I want to ask something else. After hearing these stories, do you still trust that isolation? Do you still believe that empty places are actually empty? Or do you wonder, as I do, what might be out there in the middle of nowhere, watching and waiting, patient as the mountains themselves? The wilderness doesn't hate you. It doesn't care about you at all. It existed long before humans and will exist long after we're gone. But maybe, just maybe, we're not the only ones who find those empty places useful. Maybe there are other things that appreciate the isolation, that thrive in the absence of witnesses, that wait for those rare moments when someone wanders too far from safety and into their domain. Sleep well tonight, and if you're planning a trip to the wilderness, remember these stories. Remember the tent in the meadow. Remember Dead Mountain. Remember the lighthouse keepers and the ghost ship and all those people who vanished from places they should have been safe. Remember, and maybe, just maybe, stay a little closer to civilization than you originally planned. Because the middle of nowhere isn't empty. It's full of stories like these, full of questions without answers, full of the terrifying possibility that we don't understand our world as well as we think we do. And that, my friends, is the most frightening truth of all.